You've heard the legend. The great General Hannibal, marching his elephants across the Alps to crush Rome. It's one of history's most iconic images. But what if I told you those elephants were almost useless? In fact, they nearly cost him everything. So what really won his legendary battles? The answer might surprise you. If you love unraveling history's biggest myths, subscribe and join us. And by the way, drop a comment below. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear Hannibal? Let's see what everyone thinks. Close your eyes for a second and picture it. The scene is straight out of an epic Hollywood film. A sweeping shot of the snow-capped, brutal Alps. The wind is howling, a bitter cold that chills you to the bone. And then you see them. A line of massive, shadowy figures trudging through the deep snow. War elephants. Their sheer size is staggering, their skin like leathery armor. On their backs, towers carrying soldiers, their banners snapping in the icy gale. This is the image that has been burned into our collective memory for centuries. The brilliant Carthaginian general, Hannibal Barca, performing what seemed like an impossible military miracle. He wasn't just marching an army from Spain to Italy. He was bringing monsters with him. To the Roman soldiers who first saw these creatures, it must have seemed like a nightmare made real, a page from a myth come to life. The elephants were Hannibal's ultimate psychological weapon, his trump card, the symbol of his daring genius. This is the legend. This is the story we all know and love. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, and it's almost completely wrong. The truth, buried beneath 2,000 years of storytelling and romanticizing, is far more fascinating. Those elephants, they weren't the game changers we believed them to be. In fact, they were a logistical nightmare, a constant vulnerability, and by most practical measures, a catastrophic failure. The popular narrative focuses on the spectacle, the shock and awe. But if we strip away the Hollywood glamour and look coldly at the historical facts, a different, much more interesting picture emerges. The real story isn't about the animals. It's about the man who led them. The real hero of Hannibal's army wasn't a creature weighing several tons. It was something far more subtle, far more clever, and infinitely more powerful. It was a weapon that couldn't be seen, but one that the Roman legions never saw coming, even as it utterly destroyed them. So, if it wasn't the elephants that truly gave Hannibal his legendary victories, what was it? What could possibly account for his incredible string of successes against the most powerful military machine of the ancient world? The answer lies not in the brute strength of animals, but in the brilliant, calculating mind of Hannibal himself. It was a weapon of perception, of psychology, of understanding an enemy better than they understood themselves. And to find it, we have to look past the giant creatures in the foreground and focus on the quiet genius pulling the strings in the background. The truth is, Hannibal's greatest weapon was an idea. The legend of the elephant crossing is so powerful because it appeals to our love for the dramatic and the impossible. But let's break down that iconic scene with a dose of reality. Imagine the actual logistics. Hannibal didn't have a handful of elephants. Historical sources like Polybius suggest he started with around 3 dozen. These were not creatures built for alpine climates. They required an enormous amount of food and water each, one consuming hundreds of pounds of vegetation a day. The narrow, icy paths of the Alps were treacherous enough for seasoned soldiers, let alone massive animals with wide, flat feet designed for plains, not mountain cliffs. The journey was not a triumphant parade. It was a slaughter. Elephants slipped and fell to their deaths. they succumbed to the freezing temperatures and starvation. By the time Hannibal's battered army staggered into the plains of Italy, his grand force of pachyderms had been reduced to a mere handful, perhaps only one, his famous personal elephant named Cyrus. This immediate and devastating attrition rate is the first clue that the elephant narrative is flawed. Why would a military mastermind like Hannibal rely so heavily on a weapon that was so fragile and difficult to transport? It simply doesn't add up. The Romans, initially terrified of these beasts, quickly learned their weaknesses. At the Battle of Zama, the final battle of the Second Punic War, the Roman general Scipio Africanus simply ordered his trumpeters to create a loud, piercing noise, causing Hannibal's remaining elephants to panic and trample their own Carthaginian lines. The ultimate weapon had become a liability. This forces us to ask a critical question. If the elephants were so ineffective, why did Hannibal bring them at all? The answer is not for their tactical power on the battlefield, but for their strategic power before the battle. They were a tool of terror, designed to intimidate the Gallic tribes he needed to pass through and to sow doubt in the Roman psyche before a single sword was drawn. They were part of a much larger, more sophisticated psychological campaign. This is where we begin to see the real Hannibal. He wasn't just a general, he was a master of perception. He understood that warfare is often won in the minds of men long before it is won on the field. The elephants were a prop in a grand theatrical production designed and directed by Hannibal. Their presence created a legend around him. He was the commander who could achieve the impossible, who commanded monsters. This reputation was invaluable. It made allies more loyal and enemies more fearful. But Hannibal knew that props eventually break. He couldn't base his entire strategy on them. So, while the Romans were fixated on the elephants, Hannibal was deploying his true, enduring weapon, a deep, almost supernatural understanding of human psychology, Roman culture, and the art of the ambush. He was playing a different game entirely, and the Romans didn't even know the rules. If we shift our focus away from the elephants, the panorama of Hannibal's true genius comes into sharp focus. The real winning elements of his army were far less glamorous but infinitely more effective. First, his army itself was a masterpiece of diversity and experience. It wasn't just a Carthaginian force. It was a multi-ethnic coalition of North African infantry, Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the world, Iberian swordsmen, and Balearic slingers. Each unit had specialized skills, and Hannibal, a master of delegation, knew how to use them in perfect harmony. The Numidian cavalry, for example, could ride circles around the slower, heavier Roman cavalry, a tactical advantage that proved decisive in battle after battle. But even this diverse army was just the instrument. The musician was Hannibal's mind. His true weapon was his ability to get inside the heads of the Roman commanders. He understood that Roman military doctrine was built on frontal assault, brute force, and unwavering discipline. The Roman army was a sledgehammer. Hannibal's strategy was to be the matador. He would use the Romans' own greatest strength, their aggressive pride against them. He would feign weakness, retreat in a controlled manner, and lure the Roman legions into traps of his own choosing. He studied the terrain with the eye of a sculptor, seeing how a river, a hill, or a forest could be used to channel, disrupt, and ultimately annihilate a superior force. This psychological manipulation culminated in his masterpiece, the Battle of Cannae. There, facing a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own, Hannibal executed a tactical perfection that is still studied in military academies today. he intentionally weakened his center line, allowing the Roman legions to push forward, believing they were winning. As the Romans pushed deeper, Hannibal's stronger African infantry on the wings swung in, enveloping the entire Roman army. The result was a complete massacre. It was a victory achieved not by elephants, not by superior numbers, but by superior intellect. Hannibal had turned the Roman army into a weapon against itself. He had understood their mindset, predicted their movements, and laid a trap they walked right into. This was his real secret weapon, a deep, strategic, psychological brilliance that turned the battlefield into a chessboard. The elephants were just a distraction, the opening move that set the stage for the real checkmate, which was always going to be delivered by the mind of Hannibal himself. So, the next time you think of Hannibal, don't just picture the elephants. Picture the cunning general standing behind them, already 10 moves ahead of everyone else. The image is iconic, immortalized in countless paintings and history books. Hannibal's army, a defiant serpent of men and monsters, scaling the impossible peaks of the Alps. It's a symbol of human will conquering nature itself. But this romantic vision shatters against the harsh, unyielding reality of the mountains themselves. The crossing of the Alps was not a triumphant parade. It was a descent into a frozen hell. A logistical catastrophe where Hannibal's most famous weapon, his elephants, transformed from a symbol of invincibility into his greatest liability. To understand the true genius of Hannibal, we must first strip away the legend and stare directly into the disaster. The journey across the Alps was less a military maneuver and more a desperate, bloody gamble where every step forward was paid for in lives, and where the mighty elephants became tragic symbols of a terrible miscalculation. The sheer scale of the undertaking is almost incomprehensible. Historians like Polybius and Livy give us numbers, but they fail to capture the human and animal reality of the march. Hannibal did not lead a small, elite strike force. He marched with an army of over 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and, most famously, his 37 war elephants. This was not just an army. It was a moving city, a fragile ecosystem with an insatiable appetite, and it was headed straight into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The first challenge was the terrain itself. The narrow, winding paths of the Alps were treacherous for a single traveler, let alone a column of tens of thousands. Paths were often no more than ledges carved into cliff faces, covered in loose scree, and, as they climbed higher, layers of slick, compacted ice. For the elephants, these paths were a death trap. Their immense weight, a strength on the open plain, became a fatal weakness on unstable ground. Accounts describe elephants losing their footing, sliding off the narrow ledges, and plunging thousands of feet to their deaths, their terrifying trumpets echoing through the valleys as they fell. Each loss was not just a blow to morale. It was the destruction of a massive investment of resources and a key component of Hannibal's intended psychological warfare. Beyond the immediate physical danger was the relentless, grinding enemy of logistics. An army marches on its stomach, and an army with elephants marches on a mountain of food. A single war elephant can consume up to 300 pounds of vegetation and require 50 gallons of water per day. Supporting 37 of them was a logistical nightmare even on the fertile plains of Spain or Gaul. In the barren, snow-covered Alps, it became an impossible task. The forage that sustained the army's horses and pack animals was gone, buried under feet of snow. The elephants, creatures of subtropical climates, began to suffer terribly from the cold. Their large ears, designed to radiate heat, were vulnerable to frostbite. Their feet, cracked and sore from the rocky paths, became infected. The Carthaginian army was forced to slow to a crawl, not because of Roman resistance, but because of the desperate need to find sustenance for their starving, freezing animals. The very weapons meant to ensure their victory were now ensuring a slow, agonizing demise. The situation was becoming dire, and the worst was yet to come as they ventured deeper into the highest, most exposed passes, where the elements and the local inhabitants would unite against them in a perfect storm of suffering. The human cost of the Alpine crossing was staggering. A relentless toll extracted by a hostile environment and equally hostile people. The army was not just fighting the mountains, they were fighting the local Gallic tribes, who viewed the invading force with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and opportunistic hostility. These tribes knew the terrain intimately, and they used it as a weapon. From the high cliffs, they rolled massive boulders down onto the narrow paths, crushing men and animals alike. They launched ambushes against the columns, flanks, and rear, targeting stragglers and supply trains. Each skirmish cost precious lives, slowed the march to a defensive crawl, and frayed the nerves of soldiers already pushed to their absolute limit. Hannibal himself was constantly at the forefront, managing these threats, negotiating with some chieftains while fighting others. His leadership tested in ways no battlefield could ever replicate, but the most insidious enemy was one against which there was no defense. The cold. Soldiers who had grown up under the warm sun of North Africa and Spain were utterly unprepared for the brutal alpine climate. They lacked adequate clothing, their sandals offering no protection against the snow and ice. Hypothermia claimed men silently in the night. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, forcing agonizing decisions about amputation without any medical facilities. The path through the Alps became a gruesome trail of discarded weapons, frozen corpses, and the massive, pathetic carcasses of elephants that had finally succumbed to starvation and exposure. The historian Livy paints a haunting picture of the scene, a landscape of silent suffering, where the living were envious of the dead. The morale of the army, which had been high upon entering the mountains, was shattered. This was not the glorious invasion they had envisioned. It was a nightmare of survival. Amidst this chaos, the elephant's role shifted from strategic asset to tragic burden. Their slow, plodding pace dictated the speed of the entire army. Time and again, the column would grind to a halt as a path proved too narrow or too unstable for an elephant to pass. Engineers and soldiers would have to spend hours, sometimes days, widening roads, reinforcing bridges, or carving new paths into the rock face, all while under the threat of attack and the pressure of dwindling supplies. The elephants, in their suffering, became a symbol of the campaign's hubris. What had seemed like a brilliant idea on a map in Spain had become a catastrophic reality. In the frozen peaks of the Alps, the few elephants that remained were weak, emaciated shadows of the magnificent creatures that had started the journey. They were no longer instruments of war. They were dying liabilities. The question must have gnawed at Hannibal and his officers. Had the gamble failed? Had the very symbol of their power become the cause of their potential destruction? The descent into Italy offered little respite. Only the grim accounting of what had been lost in the pursuit of a strategic surprise that now seemed desperately costly. When Hannibal's shattered force finally, miraculously, descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, the scale of the disaster became clear. The army that emerged from the mountains was a ghost of its former self. Historians estimate he lost as much as half of his infantry and a third of his cavalry. The toll on his elephant corps was nearly total. Of the 37 that had set out, only a handful survived the crossing, and many of those would perish soon after from the accumulated stresses of the journey. By some accounts, only one elephant survived Hannibal's own, a one-tusked animal named Cerus. The grand invasion force, designed to strike terror into the heart of Rome, had been gutted before it ever faced a Roman legion in pitched battle. On paper, the Alpine crossing was a catastrophic failure. It had crippled his army and sacrificed his most potent symbolic weapon. This outcome forces a profound and unsettling question that historians have debated for 2 millennia. Was bringing the elephants history's greatest blunder? Or could it have been a deliberate, calculated distraction? On the surface, it appears to be a colossal error in judgment. A general of Hannibal's renowned meticulousness and logistical understanding must have known the immense risk. He had to have understood that the Alps would be a death trap for animals of that size and temperament. So why did he do it? The simplest, most strategic answer is that the elephants were not primarily intended for the battles in Italy. They were essential for the journey to Italy. Their value was almost entirely strategic and psychological. As Hannibal marched from Spain, through Gaul, and toward the Alps, the sight of these mythical beasts had a profound effect on the local chieftains and tribes. The elephants were a tangible, awe-inspiring display of Carthaginian power and wealth. They awed potential allies, intimidated potential adversaries, and crucially, helped ensure his army could pass through these vast, hostile territories without being drawn into constant, large-scale warfare that would have drained his resources long before he reached the Alps. They were the key that unlocked the door to the mountains. Furthermore, even in their failure, the elephants served a powerful, enduring psychological purpose. The very fact that Hannibal attempted the crossing with them cemented his legend. The story of the man who marched elephants over the Alps spread like wildfire throughout Italy, far ahead of his actual army. It created an aura of invincibility and daring that preceded him. To the Romans, it signaled that they were not dealing with a conventional enemy. They were facing a commander of such audacity and brilliance that he could achieve the impossible. This psychological impact was, arguably, worth the cost of the elephants themselves. The loss of the animals was a tactical setback, but the amplification of Hannibal's legend was a strategic victory. It made every subsequent Roman general he faced more cautious, more uncertain, and more prone to the psychological manipulation that was Hannibal's true strength. The Alpine disaster, therefore, stands as a complex paradox. It was a tangible military catastrophe that resulted in the near-to-tail loss of a signature weapon. Yet, it was also an intangible psychological triumph that set the stage for everything that followed. The gamble was incredibly costly, yes, but to a mind like Hannibal's, perhaps it was a price he was willing to pay to write his name into the fears of his enemy before the first sword was even drawn. The Alps tested his army to its breaking point, but they also revealed the first glimpse of his true genius, a willingness to sacrifice the obvious for the psychological, to trade a weapon of war for a weapon of the mind. The Alps had exacted a terrible price. Hannibal emerged into Italy with a weakened, battered army, his legendary elephant corps all but annihilated. To any contemporary observer, his invasion appeared stillborn, a magnificent gamble that had failed spectacularly before it even began. The Romans, confident in the might of their legions, believed they would quickly crush this audacious invader. They were about to learn a brutal lesson in the nature of power. For Hannibal, the loss of his elephants was not a catastrophe. It was a liberation. It forced the world, and more importantly his enemies, to look past the spectacle and see the real general. The real weapon in Hannibal's arsenal was never an animal. It was an idea, cold, brilliant, and ruthless understanding of human psychology that would redefine the art of war. While the Romans prepared to fight a battle of brute force, Hannibal was preparing to fight a battle of the mind, and his canvas would be the fields of Cannae. To understand Hannibal's genius, we must first understand the Roman military machine he faced. The Roman legion was the sledgehammer of the ancient world. Its strength lay in its relentless, disciplined head-on assault. A Roman army would advance in a massive, cohesive block, its sheer weight and momentum designed to overwhelm and shatter an enemy line. It was a system built on order, courage, and the unshakable belief in Roman superiority. This was both the legion's greatest strength and its fatal flaw. Hannibal, a keen student of his enemy, recognized this rigidity. He saw that the Roman war machine, for all its power, was predictable. It was a superb instrument, but it required a predictable opponent to function optimally. Hannibal decided he would be anything but predictable. He would not meet the sledgehammer with a sledgehammer. He would meet it with a rapier, precisely aimed at the psyche of the men who wielded it. Hannibal's campaign in Italy, therefore, became a masterclass in psychological manipulation. His first victories, at the Trebia River and Lake Trasimene, were not merely tactical successes. They were carefully staged performances designed to get inside the heads of the Roman Senate and its generals. At Trebia, he used the cold weather and a hidden ambush to defeat a larger force. At Trasimene, he orchestrated a perfect ambush in a fog-shrouded defile, annihilating an entire Roman army. These were not battles of attrition. They were battles of deception. Each victory was a message, meticulously crafted to inflame Roman pride and provoke reckless anger. Hannibal was deliberately painting himself as an elusive, cunning foe who refused to fight on Roman terms. He was baiting them. He knew that after a string of humiliating defeats, Roman honor would demand a decisive confrontational battle on a scale that would leave no room for tricks. He was patiently setting the stage for a final, catastrophic confrontation where the Romans' own character would be their undoing. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the trap was about to be sprung on a scale the world had never seen. The summer of 216 BC found two massive armies facing each other near the small village of Cannae in southeastern Italy. The Roman force, led by the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, was colossal, numbering over 86,000 men. It was the largest army Rome had ever fielded, a testament to their determination to crush Hannibal once and for all. Hannibal's army, by contrast, was perhaps half the size, a mix of his veteran African infantry, Iberian allies, and his superb Numidian cavalry. The Romans, confident in their overwhelming numbers and fighting on an open plain perfectly suited to their style of warfare, were eager for battle. They believed they had finally forced Hannibal into a fight where his tricks would be useless. They were walking, with arrogant confidence, directly into the trap he had spent 2 years preparing. Hannibal's deployment at Cannae was a work of artistic genius, a formation designed to exploit the Roman mindset with surgical precision. Instead of matching the Roman depth, he did something that seemed suicidal to a conventional general. He made his center, composed of his Gallic and Iberian infantry, weaker and thinner. He then positioned his best troops, his Libyan veterans, angling them back from the center. The entire formation was a subtle, concave arc, a shallow bowl facing the Roman advance. As the battle began, the massive Roman legions did exactly what Hannibal knew they would do. They threw themselves forward with immense force against the apparent weak point in his center. The Carthaginian center, under immense pressure, began to slowly, deliberately give ground. It was a controlled retreat, a planned yielding. To the Romans, it must have looked like victory. Their mighty legions were pushing Hannibal's army back, bending it inward. They cheered and pressed forward with even greater fervor, their ranks compressing as they surged into the narrowing gap. They believed they were winning. In reality, they were being swallowed. This was the culmination of Hannibal's idea. The battle was unfolding not according to the Roman plan of brute force, but according to his plan of controlled illusion. The weak center was the bait. The retreat was the hook. And now, the kill was about to be executed. While the Roman infantry was funneling itself into a densely packed, barely mobile mass, the other parts of Hannibal's machine were swinging into action. His cavalry, superior to the Romans, had swiftly defeated their counterparts on the flanks. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, they performed a disciplined maneuver, wheeling around to strike the rear of the now encircled Roman legions. At the same moment, Hannibal's elite Libyan infantry on the flanks turned inward and attacked the Roman sides. In a matter of minutes, the Roman army was completely surrounded, trapped in a tightening circle with no avenue of escape. The sledgehammer had been caught in a vice of Hannibal's own design. The battle was no longer a fight. It was a slaughter. But how did he trick the Romans into walking right into his trap? The secret wasn't strength. It was deception. The secret to Hannibal's success at Cannae was a deep, almost intimate deception rooted in a flawless understanding of his enemy's psychology. He didn't just outmaneuver the Roman army, he outhought it. The entire battle was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection. The seemingly weak center was a deliberate feint, an invitation to tempting for the prideful Romans to refuse. Hannibal understood that after the humiliations of Trebia and Trasimene, the Roman commanders would be desperate for a clear, decisive victory. They would be predisposed to see any sign of weakness as an opportunity to redeem their honor. Hannibal gave them exactly what they wanted to see. He presented a target that appealed to their deepest instincts. A straightforward fight where their numerical superiority would tell. He weaponized their own cultural values against them. The double envelopment at Cannae, the tactic still studied in military academies, was merely the physical execution of this psychological victory. The real battle was won before the first spear was thrown in the minds of the Roman consuls. Hannibal's genius lay in his ability to control the narrative of the battle from its very inception. He chose the ground, he dictated the formation, and he manipulated the Roman reaction. The Romans, for all their discipline, were reactive. They saw a retreat and interpreted it as a collapse. Hannibal saw the same retreat and knew it was the final step in a carefully orchestrated plan. The trap was not just a tactical arrangement of troops. It was a cognitive trap, designed to exploit the Roman way of war and the Roman way of thinking. The elephants, had they been present, would have been irrelevant. This was a victory achieved by intellect alone. The aftermath of Cannae was catastrophic for Rome. Estimates suggest 50,000 to 70,000. Roman and Allied soldiers were killed in a single day. A loss of life unprecedented in Roman history. It was a defeat so total that it sent shockwaves through the Republic and forced a complete rethink of Roman military strategy. Henceforth, Rome would avoid direct confrontation with Hannibal, adopting a strategy of attrition and delay masterminded by Quintus Fabius Maximus, who earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. Hannibal's idea had worked too well. He had shattered the Roman army, but in doing so, had taught Rome how to survive him. The Battle of Cannae stands as the ultimate testament to the power of psychological warfare. It proves that the most potent weapon on any battlefield is not the sword or the spear, or even the elephant, but the general's ability to understand and manipulate the enemy's mind. Hannibal's real weapon was an idea, the idea that victory could be engineered not through superior force, but through superior thought. It was an idea that would echo through the centuries, a chilling reminder that in war, the brain will always triumph over the brawn. While the Roman legion was a monolith, a single, massive instrument of blunt force, Hannibal's army was a symphony. It was a complex, multi-ethnic coalition of North African infantry, Numidian cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Balearic slingers, and Gallic warriors. To the Romans, this diverse force was a mere mercenary horde, a collection of hired blades lacking the cohesion and patriotism of true citizens. This was a profound Hannibal's invisible army was not a weakness. It was the source of his incredible tactical flexibility and his greatest strategic advantage. The Roman war machine was powerful, but it was also predictable. Hannibal's army, by its very nature, was adaptable, versatile, and capable of a fluidity of movement that the rigid Roman legions could never hope to match. The real strength of this force lay not in its individual components, but in Hannibal's genius for weaving them into a seamless, lethal whole. Consider the elements of this symphony. The core of his infantry were the Libyans, professional soldiers who fought in a disciplined phalanx, a solid anvil upon which enemies could be broken. From Spain came the Iberians, fierce warriors armed with the deadly gladius hispaniensis, the sword that would later be adopted by the very legions they fought. But the true masters of the battlefield were the Numidian cavalry from North Africa. They were the eyes and the swift fists of Hannibal's army. Riding without saddles or bridles, they were renowned as the finest light cavalry in the ancient world, capable of incredible maneuvers, feigned retreats, and devastating hit-and-run attacks. They could harass and pin down an enemy, then melt away before a counterattack could be organized. Then there were the Balearic slingers, whose lead bullets could outreach arrows and strike with bone-shattering force. This was not a random assortment of fighters. It was a toolkit. Each unit had a specific purpose, a specialized skill that Hannibal, the master craftsman, knew how to employ at the precise moment for maximum effect. This diversity granted Hannibal a strategic flexibility that constantly wrong-footed the Romans. A Roman legion moved and fought as one entity. Hannibal could deploy his forces in a myriad of ways. At the Tribia River, he used the Numidian cavalry to provoke the Romans into a reckless advance across cold, swollen waters. At Lake Trasimene, he used the terrain and the morning fog to hide his entire army, creating an ambush on a scale the Romans had never conceived. And at Cannae, the symphony played its masterpiece. The Iberian and Gallic infantry formed the bait in the center. The African infantry on the flanks became the hammer, and the Numidian cavalry delivered the decisive blow to the rear. The Romans knew only one tune. Hannibal could conduct a full orchestra of death. This adaptability was the invisible force that made his victories possible. It was an army built not on uniformity, but on complementary strengths, and it required a commander of unparalleled skill to hold it together. That binding force was not money or fear, but something far more powerful, a loyalty earned through respect and shared victory. A mercenary army, by its nature, is often seen as inherently unreliable, loyal only to the coin of its paymaster. For Hannibal, this was the greatest threat to his campaign. He was operating thousands of miles from home, in hostile territory, with no reliable supply line. If his army's loyalty frayed, his entire enterprise would collapse. Therefore, one of his most remarkable achievements was not a battlefield victory, but the profound, unwavering loyalty he commanded from his diverse, polyglot force for over a decade in Italy. He did not win this loyalty through fear or through overwhelming wealth. He won it through personal example, strategic genius, and a profound respect for his men's abilities. Hannibal was not a distant general. He was a leader who shared their hardships and their dangers. The ancient historians consistently describe Hannibal's character in terms that explained this loyalty. He ate the same simple food as his soldiers, slept on the ground wrapped in a military cloak, and was always the first to enter the fray and the last to leave. He led from the front, sharing the same risks as the lowest-ranking warrior in his army. This created a powerful bond of shared experience. His men saw that he asked nothing of them that he was not willing to do himself. But beyond this personal courage, he won their respect through his brilliance. A soldier in Hannibal's army knew that his life was not being wasted in pointless frontal assaults. They witnessed, time and again, how their general's cunning mind turned seemingly impossible situations into stunning victories. They trusted him because he consistently delivered victory with minimal casualties, a powerful motivator for any professional soldier. He made them feel invincible. Furthermore, Hannibal demonstrated a keen understanding of the individual motivations within his army. After his great victory at Cannae, he allowed his non-African soldiers to send letters home to their families in Spain and Gaul, announcing their safety and success. This simple act showed a concern for their morale and their personal lives that went far beyond a simple mercenary contract. He also displayed a shrewd political mind, presenting himself not just as a Carthaginian general, but as a liberator of the Italian peoples from Roman dominance. He treated Italian prisoners with leniency, sending them home without ransom to spread this message. This was a strategy designed to win hearts and minds, to break Rome's network of alliances from within. For the men under his command, this grand vision gave their campaign a higher purpose than mere plunder. They were part of a historic mission. Through a combination of personal charisma, demonstrated competence, and strategic vision, Hannibal forged a collection of mercenaries into one of the most cohesive and effective armies of the ancient world. Yet even with this loyal, adaptable, and brilliantly led force, with all these advantages, why did he ultimately lose? The reason is both tragic and revealing. The tragedy of Hannibal's campaign is that his very strengths in Italy contained the seeds of his ultimate failure. His multi-ethnic army was perfectly suited for mobile warfare, for striking swiftly and winning battles. But it was ill-suited for the long, grinding war of attrition that the conflict became. After Cannae, the Romans, under the leadership of Fabius Maximus, refused to give Hannibal the large-scale, decisive battles he needed. They shadowed his army, harassed his foragers, and slowly strangled his supply lines. This new Roman strategy targeted the Achilles heel of Hannibal's invisible army, its need for constant resupply and its inability to force a political conclusion to the war on its own. Hannibal's army, for all its versatility, was a consumer, not a producer. It needed a constant flow of food, weapons, and, crucially, new recruits. The Roman strategy of attrition meant that Hannibal's veteran Carthaginians, Iberians and Numidians, who were the backbone of his force, could not be replaced. Every casualty was a permanent loss. He hoped that his victories would trigger a mass defection of Rome's Italian allies, bringing him fresh troops and supplies. While some cities in southern Italy did switch sides, the core of the Roman Confederation held firm. The grand political victory never materialized. Hannibal was left marching up and down Italy, his army gradually dwindling. Unable to besiege major cities like Rome itself without siege engines and a larger force. The ultimate reason for his failure, however, lay not in Italy, but back in Carthage. Hannibal was fighting a one-man war. The Carthaginian oligarchy, jealous of his success and fearful of his power, provided him with negligible support. While he was bleeding his army white in Italy, the Romans were learning, adapting, and finding new generals like the young Scipio Africanus, who studied Hannibal's tactics and applied them elsewhere. Scipio took the war to Spain and then to Africa itself, threatening Carthage. This forced Hannibal to abandon his Italian campaign and return home to defend his city, leading to his final defeat at the Battle of Zama. At Zama, the roles were reversed. Scipio, having secured the alliance of the Numidian cavalry, now had the versatile combined arms army. Hannibal, forced to fight a conventional battle with a hastily assembled force, was defeated by a pupil of his own methods. The story of Hannibal's invisible army is thus one of brilliant tactical success overshadowed by strategic isolation. His army was a masterpiece of military engineering, a testament to what could be achieved with adaptability and superb leadership. But it was not enough to defeat the deep-rooted resilience of the Roman state and the political shortcomings of his own homeland. He won every battle but lost the war, not because his army failed him, but because the larger system supporting it ultimately did. His campaign remains a timeless lesson. Victory on the battlefield is meaningless without the political and strategic foundation to sustain it. The invisible army could work miracles, but it could not single-handedly dismantle an empire. Hannibal stood atop the blood-soaked field of Cannae, the master of all he surveyed. The mightiest army Rome had ever sent against him lay annihilated at his feet. The scale of the victory was beyond comprehension. In the minds of any other nation, any other civilization, such a catastrophic defeat would have prompted immediate surrender. A peace treaty would have been signed, concessions would have been made, and the war would be over. Hannibal had every reason to believe that this was the final, crushing blow. He had broken the Roman army. Now, he expected to break the Roman spirit. He sent a delegation to the Senate, offering terms. But the response he received was not one of surrender or negotiation. It was a silence more terrifying than any battle cry. The Roman Senate, in an act of almost inhuman defiance, refused even to acknowledge his envoys. They were not received. For the first time, Hannibal, the brilliant strategist who had anticipated every move on the battlefield, was confronted with something he could not outmaneuver, something he could not envelop or ambush. He was facing an enemy whose greatest strength was not in its legions, but in its soul, an unbending, relentless, and terrifying will to endure. This was the unbeatable enemy Hannibal never saw coming. It was not a general, not a new weapon, not a tactic. It was an idea, the idea of Rome itself. While Hannibal was a master of the art of war, Rome was a master of the art of survival. The Roman Republic was not just a state. It was a resilient organism built on foundations far deeper than military might. Its strength was rooted in a political system that, for all its faults, fostered a profound sense of shared identity and destiny among its citizenry. It was built on a legal framework that provided stability, and on a cultural mythos that celebrated stubborn perseverance, above all else, the quality of virtues. To be Roman was to never, ever admit defeat. After the disaster at Cannae, when a terrified populace looked to its leaders for a way out, the Senate's response was to publicly mourn, then immediately begin raising new legions. They melted down temple treasures to fund the war. They freed slaves and enlisted teenagers to fill the ranks. They did not panic. They organized. This was not the reaction of a state on the brink of collapse. It was the reaction of a system built for the long game, a game whose rules Hannibal did not fully understand. The architect of this new, terrifying Roman strategy was a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus, who would earn the nickname Cunctator, in the face of national trauma and a craving for revenge. Fabius understood a fundamental truth that eluded Hannibal. You could not defeat Hannibal by fighting him on his terms. The Carthaginian was too brilliant a tactician. So Fabius devised a new strategy, one of pure strategic endurance. The Roman armies would shadow Hannibal, but they would refuse to give him the large-scale battle he so desperately needed to deliver a final political blow. They would harass his foragers, cut his supply lines, and attack his small detachments. It was a war of pins and needles, designed not to win glory, but to slowly bleed the Carthaginian army dry. To the Roman people, eager for a hero to crush the invader, this strategy seemed cowardly. But Fabius understood that Rome's greatest advantage was time. Hannibal was in a foreign land, cut off from reinforcements. Rome was home. It could afford to wait. Hannibal had won the battles, but Rome was now playing a different game, entirely one he never anticipated. The Fabian strategy was a masterpiece of grand strategy, a conscious decision to trade space for time. As Hannibal marched through Italy, burning and pillaging, the Romans simply withdrew their armies and populations into fortified cities. They abandoned the countryside, allowing Hannibal to roam seemingly victorious. But this victory was an illusion. Without a port, without a secure supply base, and with the Roman navy controlling the seas, Hannibal's army began to wither. He could win any battle he fought, but he could not besiege every city. His army, a professional force, was a constant drain on resources. The Romans, by contrast, could draw on the vast manpower reserves of their Italian allies. For every soldier Hannibal lost, Rome could recruit 2 more. The war was transforming from a clash of armies into a test of logistical and political endurance. This Roman resilience was rooted in a unique political structure. The Roman Republic was a complex web of alliances with other Italian states. Hannibal's grand strategy relied on shattering this web, on convincing these allies that Rome was finished and that their future lay with Carthage. After Cannae, several major Italian cities, like Capua, did indeed defect. This was Hannibal's greatest political victory. But crucially, the core of the Roman Confederation held firm. The Latins, the peoples closest to Rome, remained loyal. This was the ultimate testament to the strength of the Roman system. It had offered these allies a stake in Rome's successor share of plunder, citizenship rights, and protection. The system was resilient enough to withstand the loss of a Capua because its foundations were so broad and deep. Hannibal, the outsider, could not easily break these bonds that had been forged over centuries. Meanwhile, the Roman war machine was learning and adapting at an astonishing pace. The same rigidity that had made the legions vulnerable at Cannae was now being systematically purged. Roman generals began to adopt more flexible tactics. They studied Hannibal's use of cavalry and worked to improve their own. Most importantly, they began to avoid his strengths and attack his weaknesses. While Fabius and his successors kept Hannibal contained and frustrated in Italy, a new generation of Roman commanders, most notably the young and brilliant Scipio Africanus, took the fight to the enemy. Scipio did not challenge Hannibal directly in Italy. Instead, he went to Spain and systematically conquered Carthage's empire there, cutting Hannibal off from his main source of reinforcements and wealth. This was a strategic matter. While Hannibal was winning empty victories in Italy, Rome was dismantling his entire strategic position elsewhere. The Romans were not just enduring. They were evolving, learning from their defeatist to become a more sophisticated, more dangerous enemy. The pupil was beginning to surpass the master, not on the field of tactics, but on the vast chessboard of global strategy. The tragedy of Hannibal's war is that his very presence in Italy for 15 years, a testament to his military genius, ultimately became the cause of his defeat. He had forced Rome to change. The Rome that Hannibal faced at the end of his campaign was not the same overconfident, blunt instrument Rome he had humiliated at Cannae. It was a harder, smarter, more ruthless state, tempered in the fire of his invasions. The Romans had learned the lessons of mobile warfare, of strategic deception, and of the importance of cavalry. They had been forced to innovate, and in doing so, they emerged stronger than ever before. Hannibal's greatest unintended legacy was the creation of the Imperial Roman army that would go on to conquer the Mediterranean. The end came not in Italy, but in Africa, by forcing Hannibal to remain on the defensive in Italy for over a decade. The Romans created an opportunity for Scipio Africanus to launch a daring invasion of Carthage's homeland. This was the ultimate demonstration of Roman endurance and strategic depth. While still containing the threat of Hannibal, they had the resources and the will to open a second, decisive front. The Carthaginian government, panicked by Scipio's army at its gates, hastily recalled Hannibal from Italy. The man who had been the hunter for 15 years was now being hunted. The final confrontation at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC was a cruel irony. For the first time, Hannibal was forced to fight a battle not of his own choosing, on ground not of his own selection, and against a Roman army that had mastered his own methods. Scipio, having secured an alliance with the Numidian king Massinissa, now possessed the superior cavalry that had always been Hannibal's key to victory. At Zama, the student defeated the teacher. Scipio used tactics that echoed Hannibal's own, including a clever use of lanes to neutralize Hannibal's war elephants. The Roman and Numidian cavalry prevailed on the flanks and executed the very same rear attack that had decided Cannae, but this time against the Carthaginian army. Hannibal, the great tactician, was outmaneuvered. He had spent his entire campaign trying to break the Roman spirit, but he had only succeeded in strengthening it. He had won every battle but the last one, and in doing so, he lost the war. The unbeatable enemy was not a man, but a system, a resilient political and military machine that could absorb catastrophic losses, learn from its mistakes, and adapt to any threat. Hannibal's story is the ultimate lesson that military genius alone is rarely enough to defeat a determined, adaptable, and deeply rooted civilization. He mastered the art of battle, but Rome mastered the art of war. There is a fundamental, almost uncomfortable, disconnect between what truly made Hannibal brilliant and what has cemented his place in popular imagination. The real story, the intricate web of psychological manipulation, logistical genius, and profound understanding of human nature is complex. It requires nuance. It demands that we think. The myth, however, is gloriously simple. It offers a single, spectacular image: war elephants crossing the Alps. This is the version that has endured for over 2 millennia. Not because it is accurate, but because it is easy. We prefer the myth because it caters to our deepest cognitive biases. It is dramatic, visual, and emotionally resonant in a way that supply lines and strategic envelopments can never be. The elephant is a perfect, pre-packaged symbol of exotic power and impossible daring. The reality of Hannibal's campaign is a complicated lecture. The myth is a blockbuster movie trailer. And humanity, then as now, overwhelmingly prefers the trailer. This preference for the spectacular over the substantive is rooted in the very way our brains process information. Cognitive science tells us that humans are visual creatures. We remember images far more easily than abstract concepts. The mental picture of a shaggy elephant trudging through snow against a backdrop of towering peaks is unforgettable. It's a concrete, tangible fact. In contrast, the concept of the Fabian strategy of delaying, harassing, and winning through attrition's abstract. It lacks a compelling visual. There is no iconic painting titled Quintus Fabius Maximus successfully limits Hannibal's foraging capabilities. The elephant is a singular, heroic actor in the drama. The reality of victory, however, is almost always a chorus, not a solo. It is the collective, often boring, work of organization, logistics, and patience. The myth simplifies the chaos of history into a digestible story with a clear protagonist and a spectacular prop. The reality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths that victory can be slow, undramatic, and achieved by avoiding battle rather than seeking it. The myth is simply more fun. This process of myth-making begins at the source. The ancient historians who recorded these events, like Livia and Polybius, were not neutral observers. They were storytellers with agendas. For the Romans, writing after their eventual victory, emphasizing the elephant's spectacle served a purpose. It made their early defeats more understandable. Ibn Escasable. How could the noble Roman legions be expected to prevail against such monstrous, unnatural beasts? The elephants became a convenient scapegoat for the tactical failures of Roman generals. Furthermore, by focusing on the sensational, they could downplay the more humiliating truth that for 15 years, they were repeatedly outsmarted by a superior military mind. The Carthaginian sources, lost to us, would have had their own reasons to promote the legend, casting Hannibal as a figure of Herculean proportions performing impossible feats. From the very beginning, the story was shaped by the needs of the storytellers and the needs of the audience. The truth was the first casualty, replaced by a narrative that was more compelling and, for the victors, more palatable when we directly contrast the sexy myth with the boring reality. Our cultural preference becomes starkly clear. The myth is built on moments of high drama, the dramatic crossing of the Alps. The reality is about the grueling, year after year maintenance of an army in hostile territory, the endless search for food, the diplomatic wrangling with local tribes, the management of troop morale. The myth focuses on the Battle of Cannae as a single, brilliant day of tactical genius. The reality encompasses the years of political maneuvering and strategic positioning that made Cannae possible, and more importantly, the decades of Roman political will and adaptation that ultimately negated its impact. The myth gives us a lone hero, Hannibal, astride his elephant, a symbol of individual brilliance, the reality gives us complex, interconnected systems. The resilient Roman system of political alliances, the efficient Carthaginian system of mercenary recruitment and financing, the intricate logistical system of supply chains that stretched across the Mediterranean. We are naturally drawn to the heroic individual. We are often bored by the analysis of systems. Yet, it is invariably the strength and resilience of these underlying systems that ultimately determine the outcome of prolonged conflicts. Charismatic leaders can win spectacular battles, but robust systems win long wars and build enduring empires. This preference for the mythologized version of events extends far beyond ancient history and has profound consequences for how we understand our own world today. We see the same cognitive patterns in modern media and business. A charismatic CEO is given iconic status and credit for a company's success, while the unsexy, relentless work of thousands of mid-level managers and employees, the very engine of the corporation, is ignored. We focus on the dramatic political speech or the viral soundbite, not the painstaking behind-the-scenes policy work that actually shapes nations. We are wired for the spectacular, the easily digestible. The danger arises when we start to mistake the myth for the reality, when we internalize the belief that success is always born from a single, brilliant, dramatic act rather than from sustained, collaborative, and often mundane effort. Hannibal's true, enduring lesson is not that elephants can cross mountains, a spectacular but ultimately futile stunt, but that a deep understanding of your enemy's psychology, culture, and decision-making processes is more powerful than any physical weapon. But that lesson is harder to learn and far less cinematic. It requires study, reflection, and a willingness to engage with complexity. The myth offers a much simpler and more thrilling takeaway. To win, you simply need a bigger, more surprising weapon. This simplification, while appealing, dangerously distorts our understanding of how real power and success are achieved. The myth also provides a more comfortable emotional resolution than the complex reality. The story of Hannibal and his elephants has a clear narrative arc, a daring plan, a dramatic journey, a series of epic battles, and a tragic downfall. It fits the classic structure of a tragedy. The real story, however, is messier and more unsettling. It reveals that the good guys, the Romans, won not through superior virtue or more brilliant tactics, but through a colder, more profound strength, a ruthless capacity for endurance, a political system that could withstand unimaginable losses, and a willingness to adopt the very tactics of their enemy. The real story suggests that, in the long run, resilience and resources can trump genius. This is a less romantic and more cynical conclusion. The myth allows us to admire Hannibal's brilliance while ultimately siding with Roman civilization. The reality forces us to acknowledge that civilization itself can be a brutal, grinding machine. The myth is a satisfying story. The reality is a challenging historical lesson about the nature of power. Therefore, we are left with a clear, conscious choice in how we remember Hannibal. We can cling to the comfortable, exciting myth of the bold general and his pachyderm army. It is a fantastic story, full of drama and heroism. Or we can make the effort to embrace the more challenging, but ultimately more rewarding, truth. We can choose to look past the spectacular spectacle and seek the substantive lessons buried beneath. This is not to say the elephants are irrelevant. They are a crucial part of the story of Hannibal's audacity and his understanding of psychological warfare. But they are the opening chapter, not the entire book. To focus on them exclusively is to miss the profound strategic and psychological drama that defines one of history's most fascinating military campaigns. The final, unshakable truth about Hannibal's campaign is this: the elephants were a dramatic footnote, a tactical gambit that ultimately failed. The real story is one of human ingenuity, societal resilience, and the complex, often tragic, interplay of strategy, politics, and culture. It is a story that has far more to teach us about modern conflicts, business, competition, and human psychology than the simplified legend ever could. We remember the elephants because we want to be, because they satisfy a deep human need for clear, visual, and exciting narratives. But history is often less about what actually happened and more about the story we collectively choose to tell and retell. The facts provide the skeleton, but our desires, our biases, and our need for a good story provide the flesh and blood. Hannibal's legacy, therefore, serves as a powerful mirror. It shows us a man of unparalleled military genius, a tactician who has few equals in the annals of history. But it also reflects our own enduring appetite for simplicity over complexity, for spectacle over substance. The persistence of the elephant myth reminds us that the way we remember the past is always a negotiation between fact and fiction, between what occurred and what we need to believe occurred. In the end, Hannibal's story is not just about a Carthaginian general at war with Rome. It is about how we, as humans, make sense of our own history, and the stories we choose to tell, and those we allow to be forgotten, ultimately reveal far more about our own values and our own minds than they do about the past itself. The elephants continue to march through our imagination not because they won the war, but because we cannot bear to let them go. Hannibal Barca's story is the ultimate paradox. For 16 years, he roamed Italy, undefeated in battle, a ghost that haunted the Roman Republic. He orchestrated the most stunning victories in military history, outmaneuvering and annihilating army after army sent against him. He was, by any measure, a tactical genius without equal in his age. And yet, he lost. His campaign ended not with a triumphant march into the Roman Forum, but with a desperate recall to Africa and a final, decisive defeat on the plains of Zama. This contradiction lies at the heart of his legacy. How can someone win every battle and still lose the war? The answer reveals a truth that separates mere brilliance from true, lasting success. Hannibal was a master of the battle, but he was ultimately defeated by the war. His genius was immense, but it was also incomplete. He could see the perfect move on the chessboard, but he failed to fully grasp the politics of the room where the game was being played, the logistics of supplying his pieces, and the relentless will of his opponent to change the rules entirely. His story is a timeless lesson that brilliance alone is a weapon, but rarely a strategy. The core of Hannibal's failure was a fundamental mismatch between his tactical vision and his strategic reality. On the tactical level, the art of winning engagements, he was peerless. He understood terrain, movement, and the psychology of soldiers and commanders with the clarity of a grand master. At Cannae, he didn't just defeat a Roman army. He deconstructed the very concept of the Roman legion, turning its strengths into fatal weaknesses. But strategy is the higher art of winning the war, and this requires more than battlefield prowess. It demands a deep understanding of politics, economics, and grand logistics. Hannibal's grand strategy was surprisingly simple: invade Italy, win dramatic victories, and shatter the Roman Confederation by convincing Rome's allies to defect. It was a strategy built on a single, audacious premise that Rome's power was a fragile illusion that would shatter under a few sharp blows. This was his critical miscalculation. He underestimated the resilience of the Roman political system and the depth of loyalty it could command, even in the face of catastrophe. While Hannibal was proving his genius on battlefields from the Trebia to Cannae, he was losing the strategic war. His army, though magnificent, was a drain hole for resources. Cut off from Carthage by Roman naval supremacy, he could not receive meaningful reinforcements or supplies. He became a parasite, living off the land and reliant on the fickle support of the few Italian allies who joined his cause. Meanwhile, Rome was fighting a different kind of war. Under Fabius Maximus, they refused to play to Hannibal's strengths. They avoided decisive battles, harried his supply lines, and slowly stretched his army thin. More importantly, they began to fight the war elsewhere. While Hannibal was pinned down in southern Italy, a young Roman commander named Scipio Africanus was conquering Carthage's empire in Spain, systematically cutting off Hannibal's strategic base of support. Hannibal was winning battles in a theater that was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Rome was winning the war by expanding it, by leveraging its greater resources and strategic depth. Hannibal was a brilliant tactician, trapped in a strategic cage of his own making, watching as the walls slowly closed in. The greatest enemy was not the army in front of him, but the relentless, adaptable system that continued to function and learn behind the lines. This leads to the final poignant reveal of Hannibal's story. In the end, his real enemy wasn't Rome itself, with its legions and its senators. It was his own legend, the very myth of his invincibility. The awe he inspired became a trap. After Cannae, no Roman general of repute would willingly face him in a pitched battle. They had learned their lesson. The Romans, pragmatic to their core, adapted to his genius by refusing to engage with it on its own terms. Hannibal's reputation was so formidable that it neutralized his greatest asset, the opportunity to fight. He became a specter, feared but also contained. His legend immobilized him as much as it intimidated his enemies. He could not force a final, decisive confrontation because his opponents were too terrified to give him one. The ultimate price of his tactical genius was strategic isolation. This phenomenon echoes far beyond ancient battlefields. We see it in business, where a company becomes so reliant on a legendary, charismatic founder or a single killer app that it fails to adapt to a changing market. The very thing that brought initial success becomes a crutch, blinding the organization to new threats and opportunities. The legend of past victories can be a dangerous comfort, fostering a culture that venerates the old way of doing things, the elephants, while the competition innovates. We see it in technology, where a pioneering company can become a prisoner of its own groundbreaking invention, unable to pivot when a new paradigm emerges. The initial, brilliant tactic becomes a strategic trap. Hannibal's elephants were his version of this spectacular initial advantage that came to define him, perhaps even to constrain his strategic thinking. He had leaned so hard on the gimmick of surprise and psychological shock that when the Romans finally adapted, his bag of tricks, though deep, had a bottom. The danger of leaning too hard on a gimmick, whether it's a product, a strategy, or a personal brand of brilliance, is that it creates a single point of failure. For Hannibal, his entire campaign hinged on the hope that Rome would break politically after a few military defeats. It was a higher risk, higher reward gamble. When that single strategic bet failed to pay off, when the Roman Confederation held despite everything, he had no viable plan B. He had no answer for the Fabian strategy because his genius was offensive, not defensive. He knew how to win battles, but he didn't know how to win a war of attrition against an enemy with greater resources and resilience. This is the peril of over-specialization, of building an entire enterprise on one pillar of strength. A true strategic mind builds redundancy, flexibility, and multiple paths to victory. Hannibal's focus was so intensely on the art of the knockout punch that he neglected the less glamorous, but ultimately more important art of winning the marathon. His genius was a dazzling light, but it cast a long, dark shadow where strategic alternatives should have been. Hannibal's last lesson is therefore not about failure, but about the limits of a certain kind of success. It is a warning against confusing tactical excellence with strategic wisdom. In our modern world, we often celebrate the genius, the disruptive CEO, the visionary artist, the brilliant tactician. We are drawn to the story of the lone wolf who changes the game. But Hannibal's story reminds us that lasting success is rarely the product of lone genius. It is the product of systems, of resilience, of adaptability, and of the often unglamorous work of building foundations that can withstand shock. Rome won because it was a system. Hannibal lost because he was ultimately just a man, an extraordinarily gifted man, but a man nonetheless, operating within a system that he could wound but could not destroy. This lesson applies directly to modern leadership and strategy. A leader who is only a tactician is like a chef who can create one exquisite dish but cannot run a kitchen, manage suppliers, or design a menu that sustains a restaurant. True leadership requires the ability to think on multiple levels simultaneously, to win the immediate battle tactics, to campaign effectively over the long-term strategy, and to understand the broader environment in which the conflict takes place. Grand strategy. Hannibal mastered the first, but faltered on the second and third. He is the cautionary tale for the brilliant disruptor who shakes the industry, but whose company fails because it lacks a sustainable business model. Or for the political firebrand who wins the election but cannot govern effectively. The initial flash of brilliance is not enough. It must be backed by a deeper, more durable structure. So, as the story of Hannibal fades into history, we are left with a final, reflective thought. The elephants have marched across our screens and through our imaginations, a powerful symbol of daring and innovation. But let them also serve as a symbol of a warning. They represent the seductive power of the quick fix, the dramatic solution, the single stroke of genius. Do not mistake the symbol for the substance. The true lesson of Hannibal is to look beyond the spectacle. It is to value the unsexy foundations of logistics, resilience, political savvy, and adaptive learning just as highly as the moment of brilliant inspiration. For in the long run, it is not the most dazzling tactician who prevails, but the most resilient system, the most adaptable organization, and the leader who understands that genius is a tool, not a plan. Hannibal's ghost whispers to us across the centuries. Don't just be brilliant. Be wise,